In this video, we're going to look at various RV adapter cables. Anyone that owns an RV, especially a 50 amp service RV, really needs a few of these adapter cables. When you go to an RV park, you don't always have the luxury of having a 50 amp service. Sometimes you only have 30 amp service and then you have to adapt. There are many adapters on the market, and this is just a review of the most popular ones. The type that look like this are called Dogbone adapters because, of course, they look like a dog bone. This particular one has a 50 amp connector, which is a 14-50R, and a 30 amp plug on the other side. So this would be suitable for a site that has 30 amp service, but you have a 50 amp trailer and you want to adapt your power cord to the site. You would need one of these. And we can see from this drawing that we parallel the L1 and L2 legs on the 50 amp side to the 30 amp connector. And by the way, all these schematics will be available on my website by clicking on the link I show here. We also have a similar adapter. This is also a 50 amp 1450R, and this goes to a 15 amp 5-15P. And similar to the first adapter, here is a 15 to 50 amp Dogbone adapter. And while I don't have an example to show, there's also the existence of a 15 to 30 amp adapter, which will be something that you'd want if you had a 30 amp coach. Now I'm giving you the nomenclature of all these connectors, and if you go to my website, I have a drawing showing the different connectors that are available. And I'll provide the link in the upper right hand corner here. And this connector is not going to be used very often. And you could call this a reverse Dogbone. While most Dogbone adapters adapt a lower current source to a higher current capable RV, this particular one adapts a 50 amp service to a 30 amp RV, which means that the RV cord is not going to be protected by the breaker on the Shorepower pedestal. And for that reason, I don't recommend using this. I'm just showing it as something that's available in the marketplace. And from this drawing, you can see that only one side of the 50 amp connector is used for the 30 amp service. In this example, it is L1, although manufacturers certainly could have used L2. Again, I don't recommend this because I do not consider it safe. And next we have an adapter. This is a 30 amp connector with a 15 amp connector and a 50 amp connector on this end. So this is designed to plug into two different power sources and to give you 45 amps here. This discussion gets a little more complicated, and you should know how the wiring is done in the pedestal. If you're not familiar with that, I do have a video that deals with 30 and 50 amp wiring. I'll post a link here, and I recommend you watch that before you try to understand what's going on here. In this schematic, we show a typical 15 and 30 amp Shorepower pedestal, no 50 amp. However, you can see that this is a center tap transformer. And in this example, we have 30 amp available on one side, 15 amp available on the other. Also notice that L1 is fed by a 15 amp service and L2 is a 30 amp service. The marketing for this adapter is a little bit inaccurate. It is called a 45 amp service. It is not. It would only be 45 amp if both the 15 and the 30 amp were additive. However, the 15 and 30 amp service are on different legs, L1 and L2, according to the drawing. And even though L1 and L2 are separate circuits, the neutral side is combined, so the neutral is always going to have a different current than the hot side of each connection. This is okay from a safety standpoint because the 50 amp power cord is designed to handle 50 amps in the neutral. However, the current state of the National Electrical Code for RV parks requires GFI or ground fault connection for the 15-20 amp service. So we need to look how GFIs work. A GFI compares the current in the hot side of the connection to the current in the neutral side. If those two currents are not equal, the GFI trips and shuts power off. So if we look back to the last drawing again, what we can see is that we'll never have the same current on the neutral side as we do for the hot side of the circuit that goes through the GFI protector, which means this will always trip, so you cannot use this type of adapter with a circuit that has a GFI to protect it. The next issue we have is how the circuits are wired in the RV itself. Remember, we're going to have 15 amps on one side, 30 amps on the other side. Now, if you're lucky and the air conditioner is on the 30 amp side, no problem. But what if the air conditioner is on the 15 amp side? It's not going to work. So at minimum, you may have to relocate some of the breakers in your breaker panel. So my recommendation is, with more and more campgrounds putting in GFI, I wouldn't even buy this. It's kind of expensive and you're not going to be able to use it as much as you think you might. And with this adapter, this is two 30 amp connectors and one 50 amp connector. And this one is designed to plug into two 30 amp service and give you 60 amps on this end. So again, let's look how this adapter works. In this example, we have a Shorepower pedestal that provides service to two adjacent campsites. And in reality, this is almost like the 50 amp native service, except that we just have 30 amp on each leg, not 50 amp. Of course, this only works if the other campsite is vacant and you don't get yelled at by the campground management. And in a similar fashion to 50 amp service, the neutral only has to carry the differential current. That is, the difference between the leg 1 current and leg 2 current. But what happens if the Shorepower pedestal is designed to handle 4 campgrounds with 30 amp service? Now, who knows how the thing is wired, and this is just one possibility. But when you see here, we have two 30 amp services on each leg. So what will happen if you inadvertently connect both of the 30 amp connectors to the same leg? Now both legs are in phase, so the neutral no longer carries the differential current. The current on the neutral is now additive, so in the worst case scenario, if you're drawing 30 amps through each connector, the neutral now has to handle 60 amps, which is beyond the design criteria of the power cord. So in theory at least, this is an unsafe condition, regardless of how likely it is to occur. And remember, you have no idea how the Shorepower pedestal is wired, and in my view, there is a risk of danger from overloading the neutral, so I don't recommend using this adapter either. We also have a 15 amp to 50 amp Dogbone with an SS2-50P connector, which is what typically is on the side of your RV. And this one is in use, so I can't provide a better view, but I'm using this in my RV during the wintertime to keep my batteries charged. And this is similar to the other Dogbone connectors, it just has a different connector on the RV side. When using this adapter, I would limit the extension cord to 12 AWG or larger and limit it to 25 foot if possible. Most of these connectors, when you look at the 15 amp side, are nickel plated, which cuts down on corrosion. Unfortunately, I could not find any 30 or 50 amp connectors that were anything but bare copper. But if you find nickel plating, buy that over bare copper as much as you can. Now you can see that the connectors are discolored a little bit, but that's okay, as long as the discoloration is not green. However, if you see any green on a connector, that means that it's oxidized, and the oxidized portion of the connector cannot carry any current, which effectively makes this a smaller connector. And if it's bad enough that it cannot carry the rated 30 amps, the connection will overheat and melt the connector or maybe even start a fire. Now you might think you could just take a piece of sandpaper and sand that down, make it better. But my experience with oxidation is that, especially with stranded wire in here, once you see that, it's actually going to wick up into the copper. So you may have oxidized copper wiring as well. And while yes, you can probably sand oxidation off here, you can't get to the oxidation in here. So what I'm saying is oxidation on the end of the connector may be indicative of further damage by oxidation up through the wiring. Well, these are not that expensive. Just throw them out when they look like they're bad. And also, some of these cables have UL certification. For instance, there's a UL stamp here. But there are plenty that do not. You are likely to find one of 3 certifications on these power cords. UL, or Underwriter Laboratories, is a US-based standard organization and only applies to the United States. CSA is the Canadian Standards Association. Both organizations develop their own standards, and ETL is Edison Testing Laboratories. They are a third-party testing facility that tests to the UL standard. And my advice is to purchase a standard tested cord set in accordance with whatever standard is applicable to you. And finally, we have these small adapters, and here's a 15 to 30, and here's a 15 to 30, which is opposite of this. And they basically perform the same function as the Dogbones. Some people have claimed that they've had trouble with these, with melting and such. Just use the same cautions that I gave you about not using oxidized ones and such, and I think you'll be alright using those. So in summary, you're probably going to have a box with several of these in your RV because you want to be able to tackle any situation at the campground for your power needs.